Southwestern Ontario is the lightning rod of Canada, quite literally, with Windsor leading that charge. Pun very much intended. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Don't worry, no one comes here for my comedy. They come here to find out just what happened. For instance, in Leamington, Ontario, back in 2010, this day in weather history. Is there ever a good time for a tornado to strike a town? Short answer is no, but there is a worse time. In the middle of the night, when everyone is asleep, is easily the worst time, and this is exactly what happened here. It was on a Sunday, June 6th, 3:30 in the morning, when an F1 tornado struck Leamington, Ontario. Remember, everyone is asleep. Radios and televisions are off. So this could have been a nightmare. But it wasn't. It really happened. When some people hear F1, they think, so what's the big deal? It's not like it was an F4 or F5. Not so fast to judge. An F1 tornado still carries winds that reach 180 kilometers per hour, which can easily uproot trees and overturn cars. And there was evidence of all of this all over Leamington after this twister touchdown. It was not a particularly long path twister, and thank goodness for that, given what it did in such a short period. The tornado carved a 1 kilometer path of destruction along the Lake Erie shoreline. But tornadoes are associated with powerful storm cells, and they will always bring with them strong winds, heavy rain, and at times, damaging hail. With certain storm tracks, they can form what is called a gust front out ahead of the center of the area of low pressure. These gust fronts can thrust gale-force winds out ahead of and in straight lines, like a marching army from a battlefront. And they can do just as much damage to lives and property as those marching armies can do. The straight line winds associated with the same sharp cold front did indeed cause significant damage to dozens of homes, buildings, and properties that were damaged or otherwise destroyed here in Leamington. It took down power lines and even destroyed legacy 200-year-old trees. They were ripped out of the ground or snapped in half. But aside from this mess, fortunately, there were no serious injuries. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Now, there were no injuries, but it was real close. There were moments of concern for the parents of 45 Boy Scouts who were out on an organized camping trip in tents and cabins at Point Pelee National Park's Camp Henry. This is a very exposed area along the Lake Erie shoreline. It's gorgeous there. You really got to get there someday if you've never been. But on this fateful day, this F1 twister was blazing that 1 kilometer trail along this very same Lake Erie shoreline. It was nail-biting time. So here's the tricky bit of tap dancing for the park's superintendent at the time, Marion Stranich. She was fielding calls from the concerned parents and tried to reassure the families that the children were safe. Well, except for the part where she had to admit that they couldn't actually reach them because trees had fallen across the roadway. I'll just leave that one alone. In total, the tornado tore up enough hydro poles to leave about 4,500 Hydro One customers without power, and many of them were still in the dark and without sump pumps or AC through the next day. And because of that, Leamington officials very correctly decided that their approximately 30,000 residents on Lake Erie would remain under a state of emergency. That was a good move. The Leamington tornado cost an estimated $85 million in damages from what transpired this day in weather history. Tomorrow is June 7th, and we're covering a story that takes us back to the year 1692 in Jamaica. Our story tomorrow has everything. Pirates, smugglers, debauchery. Yes, where we are going, it was described as, quote, the most wicked and sinful city in the world, and, still quote, one of the lewdest in the Christian world. Arr, sounds like my kind of story, matey. Sorry, it had to be done. I promise that I am not going to speak in that pirate voice tomorrow when we dive into what could possibly have happened in Jamaica on this day in weather history. With me, your host, Captain Chris May of the Pirate Ship Podcast.